Hi Vinod, how are you doing?
Fine, fine. Shiran, and you?
I'm good. It's our first time on Aththa Daily, which we're hoping to do weekly and talk about current affairs, things that are happening around the world. I know a lot is happening, very hard for us to keep up with what is happening. What's been on your mind the past couple of weeks?
Well, I've been thinking about how the world has changed since the Iran war, since Trump attacked Iran, and how the entire sort of equation of the world power has changed in that period. And I think we are beginning to see, I don't say we see the collapse of the United States, but we are seeing the beginning of the collapse of the United States. I think that when the weakening of the United States, it reached its peak just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but its collapse actually started around then, because with the neoliberalism, the actual material base of the United States started weakening, and it became apparent during the Iraq War, when it showed that the United States could no longer fight a war on two fronts, and it was either Iraq or Afghanistan, and in trying to fight both, it fell between two stools. So, but at that point, it came to a point when it looked like the Iraqis might win the resistance, because of the level to which they had managed to reduce the logistics of the United States within the country. And they were losing more vehicles in Iraq than they were producing elsewhere. So, but they were a number of circumstances, the political trade-offs, bribery and so on, they managed, and especially the rise of ISIS, they were able to stave off defeat for a long time, but they couldn't keep it up, and that's the first indication. They couldn't keep up an occupation of a country. And after Vietnam, this was the first major setback they had. And Afghanistan went even further to prove it, although their actual losses in Afghanistan were much lower than in Iraq. But with Iran, it's completely different. It's a face-to-face battle. It's not a guerrilla war, and they've been totally outmaneuvered.
Yeah, it's a very interesting outcome. I mean, Iran is a country that has been economically sanctioned for so long, suffered many consequences because of those economic sanctions, yet it still manages to maintain a certain degree of normalcy, good quality education. Public services do function even if they're not maybe the best in the world, right? What's amazing is that they are able, despite all of that, to stand up against what we have been told is the strongest military juggernaut in the world, and using very asymmetric technology and having a largely internal military production system. I think about the military sort of industrial complex more than I do. I'm curious, like, what is the Iranian strategy, and how has it been so effective against the US in this war?
Well, the Iranians focused on the weakness of the United States. Now, there's one thing we have to realize about the United States military-industrial complex. Unlike that in Iran, its major aim is to provide profits for the companies producing the weapons. So you get very, very expensive weapons which are not as capable as much cheaper ones we produced elsewhere. So they got to the stage where actually they started copying Iranian drones which have been used in Russia. So what the Iranians did is they concentrated on the basics. They concentrated on what they were capable of doing. They raised their own technological levels according to their capabilities. They didn't go beyond the capabilities. And thereafter, they realized that the weak spot in the entire US defense network in West Asia was the Arabian countries, the Arabian Gulf countries, the Persian Gulf countries. And they concentrated on the US bases, which are legitimate targets after all, since attacks were being launched from them. And they concentrated on that, and that really broke the US ability to operate, because all their radars, the expensive radars which they had installed there, the other surveillance equipment was all destroyed. And for more than that, the United States was shown up as a kind of paper tiger for the first time in since the Vietnam War. They faced defeat in a face-to-face battle.
That's very true. I'm glad you brought up the Gulf countries example as well, right? Because as you said, a lot of these countries they took on American bases under this idea that they would be kind of a shield from their adversary, being Iran. But in the end, it ended up being a target, right? It ended up inviting retaliation. But they also have no sovereign control over the tempo of this war. It's not like the sheikhs in Qatar or the UAE or Saudi have any say in the tempo of the war, right? When advances are made, when retreats are made. It's entirely out of their hands because the bases and the policy is basically run by the US. And that to me creates a kind of political crisis as well, right, for the United States. I mean, Kissinger famously said that it's, deadly to be a friend of the United States, and even more so now. That said, I mean, when you look at some of the countries, further afield, like you see increasingly pro-US and very far-right governments in Japan, in South Korea, parts of Southeast Asia, certainly in Nepal, in Bangladesh, right? Do you see this actually translating into a shift in allegiance in the rest of Asia?
Well, I think had it not been for the Iranian war, that might have taken place. You were getting this the US hybrid warfare against China and its allies, which was slowly chipping away at the very fabric of the Chinese system, which had been built up through the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS and all these other instruments that they had. So, with the Iranian war, the system of multilateralism, of multipolar politics, has been strengthened, because these are not Iran, China, and Russia are not natural allies. They have different ideologies. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, but the common antipathy towards the United States, because of the way that the United States has been throwing its weight around, caused them to come together. And it has created a very strong bond between the three countries, which goes far beyond the military. It goes into communications. I mean, China built a brand new railway to go all the way from China to Tehran, a high-speed railway network, which is not just for passengers but also for cargo. And Russia and Iran are building the north-south corridor between Moscow and Bandar Abbas. So you're seeing a big strengthening of multipolar linkages because of this war. We're bringing the threat has brought people together, and that what China was, for a long time, China was struggling alone to build up this network through the Belt and Road Initiative especially, and now I think it has developed a will of its own. It's rolling along on its own. There will be setbacks, but I think we are well on the path to a multipolar world.
That's interesting. I mean, the Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin, he had this idea of the 5 monopolies of imperialism, right? And he would talk about the monopoly on weapons of mass destruction, right? So that's the sort of violent side. The monopoly on technology, the monopoly on access to natural resources, the monopoly on financial power, and finally the monopoly on communications, right? And since you mentioned hybrid war, like it seems to me, hybrid war is basically communications plus, actual traditional weapons. It is interesting seeing the development or lack of development in some cases when it comes to communications, because, On the one hand, by and large, even in the global south, we are still using a lot of Western communication platforms, right? Social media, for example. And a lot of our newspapers and mainstream media rely completely on these Western wire news agencies, right? So if you open any newspaper in Sri Lanka, the international page is going to be basically word for word sourced from Western media and carry all the same biases,
Yes.
right? So on the communication side, I'm wondering whether there is a rupture or not. I mean, certainly we see, things like TikTok come up, and definitely it was very hard for the West to control the narrative after the genocide in Gaza, well, the genocide which is basically still going on, right? It's been very difficult for them to control the narrative. But I think unlike in the sphere of technology, where China is, I think, very clearly taking the lead in certain areas like AI and robotics, and unlike in the field of, let's say, finances and things like that, the communications, it still seems to me quite an open thing, right? Especially if we look at communications in a broader sense, right? Education, ideology, we're still very much inundated with this kind of liberal, individualistic, consumerist thing, right? I mean, the cinemas in even Sri Lanka and most of South Asian countries are just full of Hollywood stuff. And then the local film production just regurgitates a lot of those same ideologies. What do you think needs to be done there? I mean, I think we had a much better ecosystem, during the Cold War actually, right? Because the Soviet Union was able to provide a communications ideological alternative to the mainstream. It seems to me that China, Iran, Russia, they have their state-owned media, but they still haven't come to this critical mass that challenges the things that we consume. At least that's my view. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, when TikTok came very close to doing that, which is why the United States government began to take action against TikTok and got them to divest it, and now it's basically under US control. But that shows that the knowledge is there of what needs to be done. And what has been one immediate thing that jumps to mind from the Iran war is the way that those Lego videos went viral. Now, I find that on social media you get people who are singing those songs. I mean, Trump is a pedophile. And so on and so forth. The songs that were sung during these Lego videos. So that shows that there is a certain, the Iranians at least knew what their target was, and they concentrated on that. And it remains to be seen whether they will build up on that and spread it out. And at the other end of the spectrum, you find a lot of the social media platforms of the left and of patriotic and progressive forces generally are making a lot of headway, especially because of the genocide and because of the Iran war. You find that I think the genocide created a division between what the media was trying to project and what the populace was believing in. Because it was quite open that what these guys are trying to do. And yet you find the media were trying to cover it up all the time. And it became too much. And when the Israeli forces raped the members of the flotilla, right? I mean, I think that was the last straw, because this was not Palestinians, this was Europeans. So if people are saying, if the Israelis are willing to do this to Europeans, what are they willing to do to the Palestinians? So this kind of question has been coming up, and that has led to a resurgence in the left-wing media. So there's a lot of hope from that point of view from the actual from the push coming from the masses themselves.
Yeah, that's a very good point actually. And I think it points to the fact that also for the progressive left anti-imperialist movements, the communication war is a very, very real and important battleground, right? I think across the world, especially during the neoliberal era, there was a lot of let's say, demotivation amongst the left, right, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and without the ideological backing, China looking inward with reform and opening up and all of that. And the left, at least the anti-imperialist left, has taken some time to renew itself with a new generation, but also to figure out how to use the new tools that are there, right? Because of course the traditional left, we relied on the newspapers, we relied on having trade unions and farmers cooperatives in which to have actual physical discussions and share print and so on. Now the battlefield is very much digital. And as you said, I think after Gaza, it's definitely being sort of turned against the empire, if you will, right? Their own tools. At the same time, we have still this phenomenon of, hybrid warfare, what we call like color revolution and so on, right? And social media still plays a big part of that. I mean, we look at, what happened in Bangladesh, in Nepal, to a great extent what happened in Sri Lanka as well, right? The fact that a lot of the algorithms are so opaque and we don't know what's going on, right? And the fact that the owners of these platforms are able to suppress the ideas that they don't like and tune up the ideas that they do like, right? Block people and so on and so forth. That is also a serious challenge, right? In the sort of communication war for the left. And I think there are concrete instances where we see that there have been setbacks for left and progressive forces because of the lack of ability to contest that ground with a coherent strategy, right? What do you think about that? I mean, how does sort of left-wing organizing and anti-imperialist organizing change, and does it change at all, like in this digital kind of era?
Well, if you going back to the color revolutions, we saw how it in Sri Lanka. We saw how it was being done by certain key individuals being picked by the imperialist or Western forces and used to spread the message. And you find that going on all the time, and you've got the same messages being relayed. And there are certain aspects of that we can learn from. It is necessary to build up a corpus of social media personalities who are able to challenge the predominant narrative. And I think that is one of the major things that we have to achieve. And there are ways of doing it. I mean, you got Greta Thunberg, who's one of the most prolific activists in the world today, and she was dismissed earlier as a green child sort of thing. And she was actually people, the powers that be thought that they could use her, and they were trying to manipulate her. But her stand on Palestine, especially, took them completely off guard, and she has now has been demonized. But because of the position that she held earlier as a green child, that has helped her to give the message, and she's giving a socialist message. So I think that is very important. So we need to build up personalities like that who can't be challenged easily, and because that's how they operate. They build up the individuals who were popular, and so now you get people who are on the fence. You've got people like Mamdani, right? Mamdani is not what I would call a radical. He's basically a social democrat, but he's given the United States setup at the moment, it's so far right-wing that he appears to be, I mean, they call him a communist, right? Which is most definitely is not. But people like that also make chinks in the armor of the system. And so I think we cannot think of this in a narrow sense, in a sectarian way. We have to think of it as a broad movement. And we have to learn to be far less aggressive in how we address our allies, right?
Yeah, very true. I mean, the left is often its own worst enemy.
Yes. So there are certain disagreements that we are always going to have, but the main struggle should be what's in our mind at any given moment. So I think if we develop that mode of thinking, we will be able to build up a resistance much better than we are doing right now.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think social media in a strange way also gives us a tool to kind of gauge the mass line, if you will.
Yes.
I mean, of course it's biased, of course there are, opaque algorithms, all that stuff. But it does have a kind of democratizing effect in the way that everybody, or most people with internet connection have access to it and can express their views.
Yes.
Which gives you a kind of aggregate idea of the mood among people at a particular time. It allows you to then intervene in crucial conversations and dialogues, right? So you actually intervene in what Fidel would call the battle of ideas and so on and so forth. And like you said, I think that's where those on the sort of center left, the social democrats, the people on the fence, the people who are starting to question the system become very important allies, right?
Yes.
Because I think it's strange. I mean, I see now on social media a lot of friends of mine who I would have considered apolitical, or I would have considered maybe even to the right, suddenly sharing content which I would never have imagined they would share that stuff before. So there's a clear opening, I think, to intervene right now in this whole ideological struggle, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And to push people forward. It may not be a quote unquote revolutionary situation, but there is something happening here, which I think we need to have our pulse on, right?
I would think that there's one point which is driving opposition to the system, and that is the huge disparity in wealth between the have-nots, the ordinary people, and the 1%, and especially the 50 or so people who control half the planet, right? You've got people like Elon Musk who are throwing money away, and they are getting subsidies from the government to throw away money. And this disparity is what drives a lot of the opposition, because people who are suffering, who are unable to make ends meet, especially in countries like America, in the United States, where you've got 60% or something of the people who are considered to be poor. It's a huge disparity, and it's one of the things that drove the Trumpian revolution was this actual disparity. But Trump managed to use this disparity and blame the immigrants and other people and non-white people. But at the same time, it's driving other forces within the system, which against the system itself.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, again, going back to the whole communications and social media thing, it's very much a optics thing, right? I mean, now, let's say in Sri Lanka alone, right, you can open your social media and you can see reels of farmers struggling to get good prices for their paddy, or people in the informal sector, urban youth, and all their issues, day-to-day lives, which they document on social media just as content. Sometimes it's not even political content, it's just regular content, them sharing their lives. And at the same time, you can see Dudley Sirisena buying himself a Rolls Royce.
Yes.
So this is not a disparity that you can hide anymore, right? I think the people in power are so drunk on wealth that there's no sense of accountability, or there's no sense of actual what the old moneyed classes would be very conservative about showing their wealth, right? They would hide it. But now they flaunt it. There's so much of conspicuous consumption, and that definitely is driving a great deal of resentment, I feel.
And the idea is to be able to channel that resentment into a meaningful opposition to the system.
Yeah, into something positive,
Yes.
right? Because even in Nepal, there was this opposition towards the children of the elites who were sharing their sort of lavish lifestyles on
Yeah.
social media,
Yeah.
right? And the so-called Gen Z, the youth, were rightfully angry about that. But then, when you see how the change played out, it was certainly not in favor of a systemic
Yes.
change of the sort of
Yeah.
neoliberal capitalist system, or that reinforces it.
Yeah. So one can see some of the forces that were being utilized, especially the anti-corruption movement. I mean, as you said, the corruption of certain members of the political elite was certainly a driving force behind the various color revolutions. And as you say, it didn't make any difference because it didn't change the system. But I think that now we need to channel the people's anger less against political figures than against the actual system which is holding people down, which is the neoliberal capitalist system, and specifically in countries like Sri Lanka, the colonial system. It's a neo-colonial system which is keeping us in underdevelopment. And we have to identify the prime movers behind it, like IMF and World Bank. And we should realize that when the IMF gets us into debt, they're doing it for a specific purpose. It's not to get us out of our problem, it is to be able to extract our resources much more economically for them, for the countries that back them. So I think it is very important for us to be able to focus people's attention on the systemic problems rather than on day-to-day political issues.
And therein, I think, lies the major challenge, right? I mean, we talked about one of the possibilities of social media and the way we can use new communications technology in the battle of ideas. But then that technology is just structured in such a way that it has a short attention span and it rewards certain kinds of activities, the quick dopamine hit. But the struggle we have is political education, right? And I mean, you know your Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on, and I know a bit as well. And it's political education is not something that you can do very quickly, right? It takes time. It's often collective. You can't sit, by yourself alone with your phone or a book and do it. You often have to be with a group to discuss these things, right? And there was a time that the left was able to do this because of the way production was organized, right? Because of the factory system, because of institutions like trade unions and farmers groups and so on, that you had this collective space for collective learning and you could give political education in depth. But as much as social media democratizes communications, it also sometimes kills the possibility for that, right? Yeah. So we also have to resist this temptation for, going with quick, easy slogans and going for likes and views and so on, and try to find a way to deliver depth, political discussions, political educations within the current system, right? Which is very challenging. I don't think we have an answer for that yet.
Well, I think that our time is up. This was a very interesting discussion. I think we should continue it at some point and to explore all the aspects of what we have been discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. We started with Iran and ended with political education and the crisis of the left. Let's see where the future takes us.
Yes.
Thanks, Vinod.
Thank you.